Have you ever noticed how a narcissist can seem incredibly confident around some people, yet strangely uncomfortable around others? It's subtle at first, a slight change in their tone, a flash of irritation, an unusual loss of control, a look of frustration they try desperately to hide. And if you've ever witnessed this transformation, you may have been looking at something very specific. You may have been watching a narcissist encounter a healed empath. Not an empath who is still seeking approval, not an empath who is still trying to rescue everyone, not an empath who is still sacrificing themselves for people who give nothing in return. A healed empath. And that changes everything. Because the narcissist's greatest advantage has never been their charm. It has never been their confidence. It has never been their manipulation. Their greatest advantage has always been finding people who haven't yet discovered their own power. People who still doubt themselves. People who still ignore red flags. People who still believe that if they love hard enough, sacrifice enough, and give enough, they can change someone who doesn't want to change. But the healed empath is different. The healed empath has already walked through the fire. They have already experienced the confusion, the gaslighting, the guilt, the emotional exhaustion, the endless cycle of giving and receiving almost nothing in return. And because they've survived it, they see things differently now. That's what makes them dangerous to a narcissist. Not because they seek revenge, not because they become cruel, but because they can no longer be controlled the way they once were. The first thing narcissists fear about a healed empath is their ability to see through the mask. Most narcissists invest enormous energy into creating an image of perfection, an image of superiority, an image of innocence, an image carefully designed to gain admiration and avoid accountability. For years, many people accept that image without question, but a healed empath notices something deeper. They've learned to watch actions instead of words. They've learned to trust patterns instead of promises. They've learned that consistency reveals character far more accurately than charm ever will. And once you begin seeing people through patterns instead of performances, manipulation becomes much easier to recognize. The narcissist senses this, even if nobody says it aloud. They can feel when someone is no longer buying the illusion, and that makes them uncomfortable. The second reason narcissists fear healed empaths is that healed empaths stop explaining themselves. This sounds simple, but it's incredibly powerful. When empaths are still wounded, they often feel the need to justify everything. Their decisions, their boundaries, their feelings, their needs. They spend endless amounts of energy trying to make others understand, trying to avoid conflict, trying to prove they're not selfish, trying to gain approval. But healing changes this. A healed empath realizes something important. People committed to misunderstanding you will misunderstand you no matter how carefully you explain yourself. So they stop over-explaining. They stop defending every choice. They stop seeking permission to protect their peace. And narcissists hate this, because manipulation often depends on forcing someone into endless explanations. Once the empath steps out of that cycle, much of the narcissist's control disappears. The third reason narcissists fear healed empaths is that they no longer react emotionally to every provocation. This is one of the biggest transformations healing creates. Before healing, a narcissist could often trigger strong emotional responses: anger, guilt, fear, confusion. The narcissist understood exactly which buttons to push. After all, they helped install many of those buttons. But healing changes the game. The empath begins recognizing the patterns, the bait, the provocations, the emotional traps, and instead of reacting automatically, they pause, they observe, they choose their response, or sometimes they choose no response at all. Nothing frustrates a manipulative person more than losing access to your emotional reactions, because when they can no longer control your emotions, they lose one of their most effective tools. The fourth reason narcissists fear healed empaths is that healed empaths stop confusing love with self-sacrifice. For years, many empaths believe that loving someone means enduring anything, accepting anything, forgiving everything, giving endlessly. But eventually they learn a difficult truth. Love without boundaries becomes self-destruction. And once that lesson is learned, it cannot easily be forgotten. The healed empath still loves deeply, still cares deeply, still possesses compassion, but now that compassion includes themselves. Now their needs matter too. Now their well-being matters too. Now their peace matters too. And narcissists struggle when they encounter someone who values themselves enough to say no. The fifth reason narcissists fear healed empaths is because healed empaths stop chasing closure. This surprises many people, because narcissists often leave behind unanswered questions, confusion, contradictions, emotional wounds, and wounded empaths frequently spend months or even years searching for explanations, trying to understand, trying to make sense of everything, trying to find closure. But healing eventually reveals something important. Closure doesn't always come from another person. Sometimes closure comes from acceptance. Acceptance that some people will never tell the truth. Acceptance that some questions will remain unanswered. Acceptance that understanding everything isn't necessary for moving forward. And when a healed empath reaches this point, the narcissist loses another source of power. Because the empath is no longer emotionally tied to the need for answers. The sixth reason narcissists fear healed empaths is that healed empaths become comfortable walking away. This is perhaps one of the most frightening things a narcissist can encounter. Someone who isn't afraid to leave. Someone who isn't dependent on their approval. Someone who isn't controlled by fear of abandonment. Someone who understands their worth whether they stay or go. Many narcissists rely on the assumption that people will remain available no matter how poorly they're treated. But a healed empath has learned otherwise. They've learned that staying in toxic situations carries a cost, and they're no longer willing to pay it. The seventh reason narcissists fear healed empaths is because healed empaths stop trying to rescue them. This can be incredibly difficult for natural empaths because helping people feels natural. Healing people feels meaningful. Supporting people feels rewarding. But eventually they discover a painful reality. You cannot save someone who refuses accountability. You cannot heal someone who blames everyone else. You cannot change someone who sees no reason to change. And once the empath accepts this, something shifts. Their focus returns to themselves, their growth, their healing, their future. And that shift removes a tremendous amount of power from the narcissist, because the empath is no longer investing all their energy into fixing someone who never wanted to be fixed. The eighth reason narcissists fear healed empaths is that healed empaths become highly observant. They notice inconsistencies. They notice manipulation. They notice projection. They notice guilt tactics. They notice emotional games. Not because they're suspicious, because experience taught them what to watch for. The patterns that once confused them now stand out clearly. And the narcissist quickly realizes that old strategies no longer work the way they once did. Which brings us to something even more unsettling for the narcissist. Because there is one transformation that changes everything. One shift that makes a healed empath nearly impossible to control. One realization that completely alters the balance of power. Most narcissists don't recognize it immediately. At first, they simply notice that something feels different. Their usual tactics aren't working. Their usual influence is fading. Their usual control is slipping away. And by the time they fully understand what's happening, the healed empath has already become someone they can no longer manipulate the way they once could. And that is where the real fear begins. Because the ninth reason narcissists fear healed empaths is that healed empaths no longer need the narcissist to validate their reality. This may be one of the most important transformations healing creates. For a long time, many empaths become trapped in a cycle of seeking confirmation. They want the narcissist to admit what happened. They want accountability. They want honesty. They want acknowledgement. They want the truth to finally be recognized. And on the surface, that seems reasonable. After all, who wouldn't want validation after being hurt? But healing eventually teaches a powerful lesson. You do not need someone else's agreement to know what you experienced. You do not need a narcissist's confession to recognize manipulation. You do not need their approval to trust your own perception. And once the empath reaches this realization, something extraordinary happens. Their dependence on the narcissist's version of reality begins to disappear. This is devastating for a narcissist, because manipulation often depends on creating doubt. Doubt about memories, doubt about feelings, doubt about experiences, doubt about judgment. But when someone fully trusts their own reality, those tactics lose much of their power. The 10th reason narcissists fear healed empaths is because healed empaths stop being predictable. In the past, the narcissist often knew exactly how the empath would respond. They knew which words would create guilt, which behaviors would trigger fear, which situations would provoke emotional reactions. The empath became easy to read, easy to influence, easy to control. But healing changes those patterns. The empath begins making decisions based on self-respect instead of fear, based on wisdom instead of emotional pressure, based on boundaries instead of obligation. Suddenly, the narcissist can no longer predict outcomes with the same confidence. The strategies that once worked start failing. The emotional hooks stop catching. The guilt tactics lose effectiveness. And unpredictability creates something narcissists dislike deeply: uncertainty, because control requires predictability. When predictability disappears, control becomes much harder to maintain. But perhaps the most powerful reason narcissists fear healed empaths is the 11th one, because this final transformation affects every other transformation. It's the foundation underneath all the others. It's the shift that permanently changes the relationship dynamic. And once it happens, there is no returning to the old version of yourself. The 11th reason narcissists fear healed empaths is because healed empaths discover their own worth. Not the kind of worth based on compliments. Not the kind of worth based on attention. Not the kind of worth based on being needed. Real worth. Internal worth. The kind that remains even when nobody is applauding. The kind that remains even when someone disapproves. The kind that remains even when a relationship ends. This is what healing ultimately creates: a relationship with yourself. And once that relationship becomes strong, everything else changes. Because people who know their worth operate differently. They choose differently. They tolerate less. They trust themselves more. They stop settling for crumbs when they deserve respect. And this creates a problem for anyone who benefits from their insecurity. A narcissist thrives when someone doubts themselves. A narcissist thrives when someone constantly seeks external validation. A narcissist thrives when someone fears rejection more than mistreatment. But a healed empath no longer lives in that space, and that's what makes them so difficult to manipulate. One of the biggest misconceptions people have is that narcissists fear confrontation. Often they don't. Many narcissists are perfectly comfortable with conflict. What they fear is exposure. They fear losing influence. They fear losing access. They fear losing control. And healed empaths naturally create all three. Not because they launch attacks, not because they seek revenge, but because they stop participating in unhealthy dynamics. Imagine a magician performing tricks. The audience remains amazed as long as they don't understand the illusion. But once someone understands how the trick works, the experience changes completely. The magician may still perform, but the mystery is gone. The illusion has lost its power. Healing often works the same way. The empath begins recognizing manipulation patterns: love bombing, gaslighting, projection, blame shifting, guilt tripping, emotional inconsistency. Suddenly, behaviors that once created confusion become predictable. The mystery disappears, the illusion weakens, and awareness becomes protection. This is why many healed empaths appear calmer than before. It's not because they no longer care, it's because they understand. Understanding removes much of the confusion that once fueled emotional chaos. They stop asking why certain patterns keep happening. They already know. They stop hoping someone will magically transform overnight. They understand the reality. They stop chasing impossible outcomes. They focus on what they can control, and that creates tremendous emotional freedom. Another reason narcissists struggle with healed empaths is that healed empaths no longer fear being alone. This is enormous, because fear of loneliness keeps many people trapped in unhealthy situations. People tolerate mistreatment because they fear abandonment. They remain in toxic relationships because they fear isolation. They ignore red flags because they fear starting over. But healing changes the relationship with solitude. The empath discovers something surprising. Being alone is not the same as being lonely. In fact, many healed empaths discover more peace alone than they ever experienced in unhealthy relationships. This realization is transformative, because when someone no longer fears being alone, they become much harder to control through threats of abandonment. The narcissist loses another powerful leverage point, and with each leverage point that disappears, the balance of power shifts further. What makes this transformation especially fascinating is that healed empaths don't become cold. They don't become cruel. They don't lose their compassion. Many people fear that healing will make them hard-hearted, but true healing does the opposite. It preserves compassion while adding wisdom. It preserves kindness while adding boundaries. It preserves empathy while adding discernment. The healed empath still cares deeply. The difference is that they no longer abandon themselves while caring for others. And that distinction changes everything, because self-respect and empathy can exist together. Boundaries and kindness can exist together. Compassion and strength can exist together. In fact, the healthiest people often possess both. As healing continues, something even more powerful emerges. The empath stops defining themselves through their wounds. For a long time, pain may have shaped their identity. The betrayal, the manipulation, the heartbreak, the confusion, the recovery process. These experiences become major chapters in their story. But eventually, they become chapters, not the entire book. The healed empath begins focusing on who they're becoming rather than what happened to them. Their future becomes more important than their past. Their growth becomes more important than their wounds. Their purpose becomes more important than their pain. And this is where true freedom begins. Because narcissists often maintain influence through emotional attachment to the past. The healed empath gradually releases that attachment. Not by forgetting, by growing beyond it. And perhaps that's the greatest fear of all. Not that the empath will seek revenge. Not that the empath will expose them. Not that the empath will fight them. But that the empath will outgrow them completely. That the empath will reach a place where the narcissist no longer occupies significant space in their thoughts. Where the need for validation disappears. Where the need for closure fades. Where the emotional dependency ends, where peace returns. Because at that point, the narcissist loses something they depended on, access to the empath's emotional energy. And once that access is gone, many narcissists discover a painful truth. The person they thought would always remain available has become free. Free from manipulation, free from confusion, free from self-doubt, free from emotional control. And freedom is incredibly difficult to control. If you've been through this journey yourself, remember something important. Healing isn't about becoming someone else. It's about returning to yourself, the version of you that existed before fear took over, before self-doubt became constant, before manipulation distorted your perception, before emotional exhaustion became normal. Healing doesn't remove your empathy. It strengthens it. Healing doesn't remove your kindness. It protects it. Healing doesn't remove your heart. It teaches your heart wisdom. And that's why narcissists fear healed empaths. Not because healed empaths become dangerous, but because they become unavailable to manipulation. They stop shrinking. They stop chasing. They stop proving. They stop abandoning themselves. And when an empath finally learns to value themselves as deeply as they value others, they become something incredibly powerful. A person who can love without losing themselves, care without sacrificing themselves, give without depleting themselves, and walk away from anything that requires them to betray their own worth. That is the moment the healed empath truly becomes free. And freedom is something no narcissist can ever control.